coming today to this book roundtable, Civil War by Other Means, America's Long and Unfinished Fight for Democracy. We are very pleased to be here with the author, along with other three distinguished experts on the field, two of whom will be joining us via Zoom. So today with us first is Dr. Jacqueline Jones. She's Professor Emerita, the LNC Temple Chair in Women's History and Mastin Gentry White Professor of Southern History at the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of A Dreadful Deceit, The Myth of Race from the Colonial Era to Obama's America, published in 2013, and Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family from Slavery to the Present, which its 25th anniversary edition was published in 2010. Both of these were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize, and Labor of Love won the Bancroft Prize for the year of 1986. She's also the author of 7 other books, including her latest, No Right to an Honest Living, The Struggles of Boston Black Workers in the Civil War Era, which will be published next year in January. She has won numerous grants and awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship from the years 1999 to 2004. And Dr. Jones served as the chair of the UT History Department here from 2014 to 2020, and also as the president of the American Historical Association from 2021 to 2022. Online too is Dr. Manisha Sinha. She's the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a 2022 Guggenheim Fellow. She received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. She taught at the University of Massachusetts for over 20 years, where she was awarded the Chancellor's Medal, the highest honor bestowed on faculty. She's the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, named one of the best 10 books on slavery by Politico, and featuring the 1619 Project, as well as The Slave Cost, A History of Abolition, which won the Frederick Douglass Avery Craven, James Rowley, and Shear Best Book Prizes, and was also longlisted for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. And she's a historian of the long 19th century. Her research interests lie in the transnational histories of slavery, abolition, and feminism, and the history and legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. She has written for plenty of newspapers and journals, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, many of which have been quite important pieces. And her latest book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, A Long History of Reconstruction, 1860 to 1900s, is forthcoming from Liberate. And finally with us too is Dr. Richard Reddick. He's the inaugural Senior Vice Provost for Curriculum and Enrollment and the Dean of Undergraduate Studies and Professor in the Program in Higher Education Leadership in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy. He holds courtesy appointments in the Department for African and African Diaspora Studies, the John L. Warfield Center for African and African American Studies, and serves as a fellow at the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis. He's the author of dozens of journal articles and opinion pieces, and co-author and co-editor of 4 books. Dr. Reddick teaches graduate courses on the history of higher education, multicultural modes of mentoring, social and cultural contexts of education, qualitative research methods, and undergraduate courses in Plan 2 honors and the signature course program in undergraduate studies. Dr. Reddick is an award-winning teacher and scholar, most recently receiving the 2021 to 2022 President's Award for Global Learning. And at the 2019 Tower Awards, Dr. Reddick was named Outstanding Community-Based Learning Professor. And in 2018, he received the Austin Leads Award from the Austin Community College Office of Equity and Inclusion's Ideal Center. And the author here today, these are really distinguished scholars, is Dr. Jeremi Suri. He holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs here at the University of Texas at Austin. He is a professor in the University Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Professor Suri is the author and editor of 11 books on politics and foreign policy, most recently the book today in discussion, and his other books include The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office, Liberty's surest guardian, American nation building from the founders to Obama, Henry Kissinger and the American century, and Power and Protest, Global Revolution and the Rise of the Dawn. His writings appear in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and many others. Professor Suri is a popular public lecturer and comments frequently on radio and television news. His writing and teaching have received numerous prizes, including the President Associate's Teaching Excellence Award from the University of Texas and the Pro Bene Meritus Award for contributions to the liberal arts. And as well, he also hosts a weekly podcast, This is Democracy. Okay.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful.
10 minutes.
Yes, okay, so thank you for that very kind set of introductions, and thank you, Jackie, Manisha, and Rich for giving your time. Thank you, Jorge, for organizing this event, and Courtney Meter, who's I think on the Zoom. Thank you, Courtney. You are always just such a wonderful person to work with, Courtney. We're lucky to have you in the department. So I wrote this book in part because even though I've been writing American political and diplomatic history for a long time, the last 6 to 7 years have shaken me. They've shaken me because in spite of all the flaws in American democracy that we as historians know well, things that shouldn't have happened, even within that context, were happening the last 5 to 6 years. And I don't have to go into detail for that. Often when I'm doing book talks at bookstores and elsewhere, I ask people how many people have been shaken by the last 5 to 6 years, and everyone in every context raises their hands. Yes. This book was my effort as a political historian, not necessarily a historian of the 19th century, but as a political historian to understand the roots, the historical roots of much of what we've seen in the last 5 to 6 years. Historical developments and historical foundations, sicknesses, cancers within our system that we had not fully diagnosed. We knew they were there. Other historians, including Manisha and Jackie and Rich, had written about these before, of course. Eric Foner, we need to add to the list, Stephen Hahn, and many others. But I think these cancers in our system were not fully appreciated by many of us. And this book is also an optimistic book in its intention, and I hope in its execution, because one of the points I wanted to make is that these cancers in our democratic system, they're there for a reason. They were choices that were made at a particular moment, at a particularly plastic moment in our history at the end of the Civil War, not the only moment of choice, but this was a moment of choice. In the past, I've written about wars of choice. These were institutions built in a moment of choice, and these choices can be unmade, not easily unmade. But these are choices of human agency, not of the American soil per se. And so I thought what I would do for an audience of scholars, of distinguished scholars today, rather than a bookstore audience, is just lay out, I think, what are 5 historiographical or scholarly interventions I think the book is making. These are not all original to me. I think the connection of them to the world we're in today, which is where the book starts, with the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, following the lynching of George Floyd. That's one of the more unique parts of the book. But many of these interventions are interventions where I hope I'm leaning in and leaning on the work of other scholars, as well as my own original research. So in that sense, this is an original book, but it's also a synthetic book, as I think any book that tries to take on these kinds of issues will be. So the first of these issues is war, how we think about war in American society. And I am certainly not the first, nor the 10th, nor the 100th scholar to say that the Civil War doesn't end at Appomattox. Of course, that's an old story. Textbooks seem not to have caught up with that, but that's an old historiographical point. But for me, what's interesting as a political historian is how the war continues to infect the politics, not just in the South, but the politics in the North, which I don't think has been sufficiently appreciated. And what I try to show in the book, especially when we get to Ulysses Grant's presidency, is how much the Republican Party is still a party, the good guys in a sense, the Northern Republican Party is still a party of the Civil War, a party that is committed to ending slavery, but not committed to the work of ending the elements of a post-slave society, the work that prevents a post-slave society from being a free labor society. That the free labor commitments of the Republican Party are actually not free labor commitments in the South. They're free labor commitments in the North and the West. And the difficulty that Ulysses Grant has, and Ulysses Grant is a flawed leader in many respects, but the political difficulties Ulysses Grant has that I did not appreciate till I'd done this research. And I highly recommend, I'm speaking to the people who know this material as well as I do, as my commentators here. But when you read Grant's letters, I did, and you read Grant's correspondence, and by the way, he's a beautiful writer, as his memoir reveals. It's wonderful. It's a pleasure to read his correspondence. You realize how much he is fighting against his own party. How much he is fighting against his own party, not simply fighting against the South. It is Senators John Sherman from Ohio, Lyman Trumbull from Illinois, Fessenden from Maine, and many others who are as much the opponent of carrying out the Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act, as much the opponents of the Justice Department, created by Grant, by the way, in its work in the region. And why is that? It's because the Republican Party is still rooted in its pre-Civil War, northern white, small shopkeeper, Midwestern, upper New York State roots. And those roots continue to characterize and divide the Republican Party. I think that's been underappreciated. It's certainly been underappreciated by diplomatic historians who want to write about now a new united country going out into the wider world at this moment. Second intervention that I just want to put on the table, and again, there's much more to say about all of these. Second intervention is about counterpolitics. That it's not simply resistance, which is often, at least as political historians, how we talk about this, but there is organized Confederate counterpolitics. That in fact, just as we've now come, thanks to the work of Matthew Karp and a number of others, to see the Confederacy as having a coherent foreign policy, there is also a coherent politics that survives the Civil War. It's not simply resistance. And one of the things I tried to show in the book is how this counterpolitics is built around race, built around a certain set of economic needs for the region. But most of all, I think it's actually built around capturing the federal government. And I think it's the beginnings, and here you can feel the 20th century historian in me reaching back to the 19th century. I think what we see in this narrative in these 20 years is the beginnings of the world we all know very well, where the anti-federal activists in our society are the ones reaping the greatest rewards from the federal government. That the political discourse of counter politics in the US is to be against the federal government and demand more resources from it and grasp those resources as tightly as you can. This is our politics of the South in the late 19th century. It's the politics of base naming and why our military bases are placed where they are. You have an anti-militarist, anti-union South that demands actually military pork in the early 20th century. And then, of course, you have the politics of the Southwest today, Texas being at the center of this to some extent, right? Where we're anti-federal, but we're a net recipient of federal money. It's the states that are supposedly seen as the more pro-federal states that actually get less of the money. Those politics begin here. And I don't think that long history has been fully appreciated. Third point, the most fun part of this book to write about was writing about, for those of you who've had the chance to read it, these exiles, these figures, and Jackie got me started on this. So you probably don't remember my email a few years ago asking you for sources on this. And it was helpful to me that Jackie said there are only a few books that are written on this. I thought I was missing a whole literature. The degree to which not just the Civil War is an international event, but that we as international historians need to take the internationalism of the post-Civil War years much more seriously. In most international history courses, most works by diplomatic historians that I know well, this period, 1865 to 1875, 1880, is seen as a hyper-internal period. Reconstruction is seen as an internal story. It's actually a very external story. The exiles, about 50,000 of them, who leave the country, many of who I describe in the book, go on to join the Mexican, not really the Mexican, the Imperial Army of Maximilian in Mexico, implanted there by Louis Napoleon, fighting the Republican forces in Mexico, as well as fighting to return to the United States. They're a settler community there. They bring their slaves as indentured servants. They seek to return to the United States. This is part of a long narrative of reaching across the border in the South to actually find solace for Confederate ideas and then trying to bring those ideas back. And in fact, they succeed. I did not appreciate that. I did not know their story until I wrote this. I don't think it's been nearly well covered enough by historians. A couple of our fellow historians have told me they're now thinking of rewriting their textbooks to include a little bit of this in it, which I hope they will. In the case of Texas, I'll just pull that out as an example. Alexander Watkins Terrell, who's one of these figures. He's a judge in Harris County, becomes a Confederate general, joins Maximilian's army, refuses to surrender, joins Maximilian's army as a spy. So this is textbook treachery, comes back to the United States, is pardoned, and then becomes a member of the Texas Senate. He writes the legislation for creating the University of Texas. He's quoted in the room on the second floor of the tower. Which room is that? That ornate room?
Main 212.
Main 212, right? This ornate room that we use for big donor events. If you look up, I was doing a donor event there. He's quoted up there. The University of Texas must stand for God and country, he says. It's a man who left his country to join a foreign army. He wrote the voting laws in Texas, ladies and gentlemen, and he is the author of the white primary. Interestingly enough, I've given, by my count, I think 6 or 7 talks just to Texas lawyers on this book in the last few weeks. And I've asked every community of lawyers, most of whom were educated in Texas, requiring Texas history in middle school, as everyone knows, how many of them knew what the white primary is? Less than half. These are high-powered lawyers in Texas. Graduates of UT Law School don't know what the white primary was, which also tells you something about how we educate people about this. So the man who is a Confederate who leaves the country, commits treason twice. He's part of a large group I talk about. He comes back and actually writes the laws in our society. What could be a more diabolical, but also a more international story, right? It is the presence, his ability to hide out in Mexico that gives him the opportunity to come back and do this. Just to give you one of these other figures, a non-Texas figure, Matthew Fontaine-Maury, who all of us would know if we were geographers. He's really the leading geographer of the 19th century, founder of Virginia Tech University, offered the presidency of the University of Virginia. There are buildings named after him on every campus today. He's one of these figures. He's one of these figures as well. Fourth intervention. I don't think we, at least as historians, maybe legal scholars, I'm not even sure they have really fully grappled with the constitutional dysfunction of our society. I have chapters on, and that are certainly not original to me, on the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, first impeachment, and the failed conviction, the bribery that saves him from his conviction, and I know Manisha has also written about this, and the 1876 election, both of which are disasters. The Constitution does not work. The impeachment process does not work for all kinds of reasons. The biggest reason being that it's very hard to get Congress to unseat the president when they're going to make one of their own the new president. Very hard, because they all fight over who that would be and would rather go into the next election rather than have Benjamin Wade or whoever else it would be become president. And our election system doesn't work because what we see in 1876 is what C. Van Woodward argued 60 years ago, 70 years ago. We still don't know who won that election. We know Samuel Tilden got more votes, but in 3 states, right? South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, the votes are so close and legitimately disputed, not fake disputes, real disputes, that it's hard to know who won. It's hard to know who won, which leads us to actually not have a duly elected president and actually justifies 40 years of claims of fraud in elections repeatedly. We somehow have forgotten to teach this. The elections from 1876 to 1896 are one disaster after another. Incredibly close elections, incredibly high turnout, by the way. Closer elections, more partisanship, breed more turnout, as we see today. And elections that are so close, it's hard to know who won, where there are legitimate claims. And the Electoral College is only one part of that story. Local control of elections is a real problem. And local certification. We have relearned that today. But one of the points of my book is this is an old problem. We are simply fortunate for about a century, with the exception of Kennedy-Nixon, that we don't have close elections. But once we have close elections in our society, our system does not work. It never has worked. And why we as historians have found that hard to recognize is actually quite extraordinary. It shows how truly presentist we are when writing in the 70s and 80s, when everyone thinks every election will look like a Reagan-Carter election. Final point, and the one that actually my fellow panelists here have actually all 3 done extraordinary work on that I leaned on in this book, is the presence, the pervasiveness of violence in American politics. The pervasiveness of violence in American politics. That's not new to our moment now. In fact, we're still nowhere near the amount of violence that there was in our politics at the end of the Civil War. Here's what I've come to conclude, and I wonder if the panelists agree, that actually in some ways American society becomes more violent after the Civil War. Because during the Civil War, the violence is largely contained within certain areas. It becomes pervasive, not just in the South, but particularly in the South. The number of coups, just as one example, local governments in Colfax, in Memphis, Wilmington, and elsewhere, where quite literally white mobs, organized white mobs, overthrow African-American and other non-white governments. This is not the exception. This is actually the repeated phenomenon. I draw in the book on the congressional hearings, and don't ever think congressional hearings aren't important. The congressional hearings around the 1866 Memphis Riot. And we see from just the beginning of the first years after the war, how organized white communities are in so many areas of the South, not simply to enforce their control, but to use bullying tactics and intimidation. Public rapes intentionally used to discourage political participation and independence. And with, it has to be said, in almost every one of these cases, law enforcement, local law enforcement, being the key actors on the sides of the violence. The courage and the extraordinary actions of former Union African-Americans who become Union soldiers and then become independent militias of their own, and Northern Republican supporters deserves a lot of praise. I try to cover that, but the political violence itself is striking. And I think we have to grapple as historians much more with how violent our society is, how present violence is, and why, this is what I'll close on, why we have trouble dealing with it today. Our laws are actually not well prepared for political violence in our society. And that's because it's been normalized and present for so long. And my main evidence of that for you today is the law we are using to prosecute those who broke into the Capitol. I think 900 some odd individuals have been prosecuted, is the 1871 Anti-Ku Klux Klan Act, which shows how archaic we are in our preparation for this. And it's actually one of the problems. It's one of the reasons why the sentences for those who have broken in to the Capitol are so much lower than drug dealers. Because the drug dealer laws, the anti-drug dealer laws, are laws of the 1970s and 80s at a moment when we're pro-incarceration, right? So we create large incarceration possibilities. But our laws from the 1870s are in a different moment. And so in a sense, right, we are prosecuting people for conducting a coup in 2021 with laws from 1871 that make it very hard for us to actually punish them in the way I think we all would presume that they should be punished today. That's not just having laws that are out of date. That actually tells us something about what has been acceptable within our society, what we have internalized and normalized, and what we haven't. And I'll just close with the gentleman who broke into Nancy Pelosi's house. I've read the affidavit from the FBI. It's available online. I encourage you all to read it. Because, and I'm sure Manisha and Jackie and Rich would agree with this, it could have been written by Ben Tillman in 1880. What does this gentleman say who broke in? First of all, by the way, he was here illegally from Canada, but no one actually comments on that. Right? He was here illegally, because he's illegal from Canada. We don't make the same arguments. He says he wanted to break Nancy, I think we call him Speaker Pelosi, Nancy's knees. He wanted to break Nancy's knees and wheel her into Congress, so all the Democrats would see that there were consequences to their actions. This is Ben Tillman saying he wanted to cut off the arms of African Americans who voted, so other African Americans would see what happened if they voted. Right? And the normalization of that rhetoric, I think, is part of this story. So I'll leave it there.
Oh wow! Okay. 5 substantive interventions here. Jackie, your first 10 minutes.
Sure.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be back. Jeremy, congratulations on the book. You know, I think it's terrific. So many Americans don't know that much about Reconstruction. So it's great you've written for a general audience. Not many people outside the academy have digested Eric Foner's magisterial book on Reconstruction, but such an integral part of our history. And again, so little is known of it, I think, outside the academy, and I applaud you for doing this. And I look forward to Manisha's book too on Reconstruction. I mean, it's really essential that we bring this material to a wider audience, I think. So anyway, thank you for asking me to comment. I thought I would talk about the main takeaways for me, and then look very briefly at a couple of groups I think you might have included in your analysis, and end with trying to redeem my home state of Delaware there, but I'll come to that in a few minutes. So I think, really the heart of the book focuses on the tactics of neo-Confederates from 1865 to 1885. And as you put it so well and so succinctly, the white supremacists used everything they had. They used everything they had. And in fact, the book could be read as kind of a laundry list of tactics, of strategies to promote white supremacy and the suppression of Black civil rights. Among those tactics, glorifying the martyr, John Wilkes Booth, as you pointed out earlier, leaving the country, going to Mexico to create a so-called colony that would later supposedly be reunited or be united with the United States. Creating narratives of Confederate courage, strength, loyalty, commitment, fomenting riots, massacres, and lynchings of Black men and women, disfranchising Black voters, and also taking advantage of undemocratic institutions such as the Senate and the Electoral College, and federalism as well, really, to suppress Black power and shield the states from violating Black civil rights. So that I found fascinating, just this wide variety of strategies, political, violent narrative strategies employed by neo-Confederates, really quite a range there of tactics. But to go on to my second takeaway, you rightly portray the white Republicans as feckless. Indeed, I think that the Southern white Democrats owed their power to white Northerners and federal officials' weaknesses. And we might ask ourselves why, after the loss of more than 700,000 lives in the Civil War, did Jefferson Davis die a natural death? Well, a lot of answers to that question, I think. Republicans in general were naive about the efficacy of so-called peaceful methods in protecting the rights and bodies of Black people. Some Republicans, and I'm thinking here of Chief Justice Salmon Chase, wanted to cultivate a national constituency of voters because they wanted to run for office someday. So they had to appeal to white Southerners as well as white Northerners. And that impulse, of course, really dampened commitment to Black rights generally. Some Northern merchants, cotton mill workers wanted to, had a vested interest in the revival of a cotton economy and the continuation of Black men and women as field hands in the cotton fields. Northerners and Congress deferred to the states on voting and so forth. And I think eventually the North just became fatigued and really indifferent to Black rights, while Southern willpower remained strong. And I think this is one of your points, that the kind of fight goes out of the North while the South retains, the white South retains that will to fight well after the war. Finally, you do point out too that the North's attention was diverted by the desire to get rich and protect large corporations, including the railroads. So there was a new agenda for the North, right? And that was a kind of a corporate capitalist agenda after the war. And all together, the Republicans' naivete, the structural federalism, the Northern fatigue, the turn toward capitalism, all these things allowed the white South to continue this neo-Confederate project. So I do have a couple of suggestions of groups you might have included in your analysis. And the first is people of color. It's really a story of white men and their machinations, I think. But another part of this equation was Black resistance to white hegemony and Black assertiveness against white supremacists. In that sense, I think the neo-Confederates were quite literally reactionaries. They were pushing back against Black people's efforts to vote, own land, integrate streetcars, and so forth. In other words, a lot of the impulse and a lot of the determination on the part of the white South was a reaction to Black people's assertiveness. And I think that story of assertiveness, especially once a new generation comes of age there in the 1880s, and so, that helps to explain a lot of the reaction going forward into the 1890s, and especially the prevalence of lynching and other kinds of domestic terrorism. So in other words, I think Black men and women played a larger part in this story than indicated here. And I will also say that virtually no women are mentioned in this book. I understand why that was, but I don't think we should leave women, white women, North or South, off the hook here. If you look at white women, they're very keen to protect the privileges of their children in school and later in the workplace. Many women are on board with this project, the neo-Confederate white supremacist project. So I think they should be included too. A couple of other points. You mentioned that the military was a force for good in promoting a multiracial democracy there soon after the war. But that institution too, we have to remember, was shaped by white supremacist imperatives. During the Civil War, Black soldiers, for most of the conflict at least, received lower pay than their white counterparts. They remained confined to fatigue work, basically, and they were barred from receiving commissions as officers. And until 1948, of course, served in segregated units. So, two-edged sword there, so to speak, with the military. On the one hand, yes, military intervention was absolutely necessary in the South after the war to protect the rights of Black people. On the other hand, that institution itself was riddled with segregationist impulses. And I also wanted to mention the importance of class issues too, because we know that during this 20-year period after the war, employers and landowners and politicians sought to manipulate poor whites and estrange them from impoverished Black people, in the process preventing interracial labor and political coalitions and justifying lynching and disfranchisement. So these class issues bring me to the beginning of your book, and I'll end on the introduction to your book with your focus on Kevin Seafried of Sussex County, Delaware. You open your book with an account of Sussex County. There are neo-Confederate groups there, Sons of Confederate Veterans, the Delaware Grays. Kevin Seafried carried the Confederate flag on January 6th into the Capitol. We know that he pressured his 24-year-old son, Hunter, and Hunter's girlfriend to go to the Capitol on January 6th. Last month, Hunter, the son, was sentenced to 24 months in jail. Prosecutors had recommended 64 months. And Kevin Seafried, whom you mentioned here in the beginning, is to be sentenced in January. I think, to have Kevin Seafried be kind of the face of this project is a bit misleading. I understand, Sussex County is rural, it's depressed. But it leaves rich white people out of the equation to focus only on Kevin Seafried. This guy, he's a piece of work, to be sure. Whether his main impulse was one of white supremacy, I'm not sure. That's not clear. But I do know that by focusing on him, you seem to imply that this project is dominated by impoverished or white people who are from distressed communities and who are resentful for a variety of economic and cultural reasons. But I think we can all agree that the Neo-Confederate project lives on not only in rural depressed areas, but also in gated communities. And that's why I think the emphasis on Kevin, I am a native of the state of Delaware. The emphasis on Kevin, I think, was just a bit misleading, but I do know why you began with him. So I would just end by saying, Jeremy, I was shocked by your opening comments that you consider this a somewhat optimistic book, because I really don't, because I think the overall message is a dispiriting one. And that is that, and here I'm quoting you, that anger and resentment are more powerful than goodwill and hope in shaping democracy in the United States today. And that is a very frightening conclusion, it seems to me. But anyway, I look forward to your comments on my comments, and I'll yield to Manisha now.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you. Manisha?
Yes, thank you. Thank you again to the Institute for hosting us, Jeremy for inviting us, and Courtney and others for making this event possible. I'm going to read my comments because I'm really nervous about overshooting my time. And I'll just begin with the theme that Jeremy referred to in his opening remarks on how current events have led him to write this book on this very fraught period in American history. So ever since Donald Trump occupied the White House for 4 years due to a perfect storm, I would argue, of unlikely forces, journalists and scholars have written about the political crisis of American democracy. Now, like Jeremy, I am well aware of how the legacies of the national conflagration over slavery continue to inform our current political debates about a host of issues. Despite the founders' fond hopes that the American Republic would not be subject to partisan divisions, the two-party system has been firmly entrenched in American politics, as we all know, from the start. So today we live with the third-party system born during the age of the Civil War, even though the two parties in question, Republican and Democratic, have flipped ideological and political roles. So partisan polarization in US history is nothing new. But for some pundits, it has reached a stage where civil war has become virtually inevitable. The fact that armed right racist groups and extremist militias have taken to calling for another civil war, and that frightening rhetoric of the guy who assaulted Speaker Pelosi's husband, this has all made domestic terrorism one of the gravest threats to the country today, and it has amplified fears of political violence. We've all seen the Civil War, the Confederacy trending on Twitter. So Jeremy's very sensible book on the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, I think, really does point to solutions of the crisis in American democracy today. It's a lively, synthetic account of the period that I highly recommend people read, but it also serves as a cautionary tale for our current political problems. Now, unlike the conventional periodization of Reconstruction from the end of the Civil War to the so-called Compromise of 1877, Jeremy bookends his work with two presidential assassinations, Lincoln's in 1865 and James Garfield in 1881. So he's clearly inspired by the January 6th insurrection of Trump's loyalists, recapitulating the horror of watching the Confederate battle flag desecrate the Capitol. That did not happen even during the Civil War. And he seeks to investigate, quote, the fanatical rage that has its historical roots in the Civil War. Now, Jeremi opens his book with Lincoln's assassination and the Confederate actor, John Wilkes Booth, his assassin. But he makes a strange statement here, quote, the Civil War empowered the democratic claims of both the president and those who demanded his death. Actually, the Confederacy was a pro-slavery, anti-democratic nation led by slaveholders who refused to abide by the victory of a democratically elected president. Sounds familiar. But Jeremi does hit the nail on the head when he alludes to the hopes of, quote, a multiracial democracy that the Civil War and emancipation unleashed, and the way, quote, Confederate resistance embraced the image of Lincoln's assassin. I think this is important because we can't view the two sides as sort of two contesting sides of American democracy. One side is clearly has very little to do with democracy and is in fact quite intent in overthrowing it. Now, Jeremi must also be commended, as he mentioned in his opening remarks, for discussing the oft-neglected transnational dimensions of the Civil War, devoting an entire chapter to Confederate exiles' alliance with European imperialism in the form of the French-imposed rule of Maximilian I in Mexico from 1864 to 1867, and the Union support for liberal nationalists led by Benito Juarez. Now, like the rise of authoritarianism today, imperialism was a global phenomenon in the 19th century, and the North and South revealed their ideological inclinations in choosing sides in the Mexican conflict. In short, I wanted Jeremi to be a little more heavy-handed in making those connections that he does already. The central issue of the Civil War, Jeremi astutely discerns, was emancipation, Black citizenship, and interracial democracy. The result of the war is precisely what would give rise to a strong reaction by Southern elites. Suri aptly calls them, quote, white citizens of privilege who had lost control of Southern politics. He describes, as he did now, in great detail, the massacres in Memphis and New Orleans in the summer of 1866, the restored Southern state governments under Andrew Johnson, and their institution of the Black Codes. Suri, however, claims, and this connects to Jackie's point about class, that, quote, the Black Codes boosted poor white citizens by protecting their opportunities from African-American competition. They did no such thing. Instead, the Black Codes gave Southern planters free access to Black labor, putting it as close a state to slavery that they possibly could. They helped elites, not poor whites, quite akin to right-wing populist rhetoric today that disguises adamantly pro-corporate policies. Now, the Black Codes, of course, marked the start of Reconstruction, as Jeremi shows, when congressional Republicans retaliated with the passage of the first federal civil rights laws, the 14th and the 15th constitutional amendments that guaranteed equal protection of the laws, and voting for adult male citizens, regardless of race and previous condition of servitude. It would also lead Congress to impeach the President of the United States for the first time in American history for his obstructionism. The 7 senators who granted Johnson a reprieve in not voting to convict him, one of whom was clearly bribed, as you mentioned. Maybe you give too much to these moderate Republicans. Johnson came within 1 vote of being convicted by 2/3 of the Senate, the closest any president has come to being impeached. Now, as the great radical Republican Congressman Thaddeus Stevens put it, Johnson behaved with remarkable arrogance for a man made president by a bullet. The real battle, as Jeremi, I think, really adeptly shows in the book, was waged in the South, where former Confederates unleashed a campaign of political terrorism to oppose Reconstruction. It is often said that the North won the war, but the South won the peace. In the end, the Union won because of its superior political leadership, military generalship, and cause. This is all, these are all points that the lost cause mythology has, of course, completely refuted. But even the popular Union General, President Ulysses Grant, and congressional Republicans, after initially reacting forcefully to racist terror in the South in the form of the Ku Klux Klan and other assorted paramilitary groups, were on the defensive by the 1870s. The rise of the liberal Republicans who opposed Reconstruction and worshipped at the feet of laissez-faire, anticipating the Gilded Age, the financial panic of 1873, Democratic victories in the 1874 midterm elections, and finally the 1876 presidential elections, when the last Republican governments fell in the South, doomed Reconstruction. So this was not just the North losing interest. Things were happening in the 1870s that made the North lose interest in Reconstruction. And I would also dispute the fact that these presidential elections were all closely contested, because let's remember that Black men have been disfranchised. So in fact, Tilden does not win the popular vote, which is constantly said by historians, because in fact, Black men are terrorized into not voting. Who knows what the popular vote would have been if they had indeed been allowed to vote in most of the southern states that had been restored to white supremacy. A conservative Supreme Court let the perpetrators of the brutal Colfax massacre mentioned by Jeremy go free in United States versus Cruikshank, one of the Supreme Court decisions that led slowly but surely to Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is where I would also have hoped that, Jeremy, you would have paid more attention to this historical path from Reconstruction to Jim Crow and disfranchisement, which indeed would have centered African-American efforts to resist this. And what most historians now call the long civil rights movement, rather than looking mainly at presidential history, whether it was Hayes' reconciliationist policies or Garfield's agonizingly slow death. Though I don't blame you, you're a presidential historian also, I understand that. Now, the book concludes with an important last chapter on the legacies of the Civil War and its aftermath. And I think this is where Jeremy's contribution is the greatest, to connect those legacies, not to say that we are on the verge of another civil war, but to see how those political legacies have actively harmed our democratic experiment. The fight for an interracial democracy in the United States continues, Jeremy notes, and he points out practical ways in which Americans can defend their democracy to meet current challenges. I guess this is where the optimism comes, including reforming and protecting our elections, especially the convoluted process of electing presidents, partisan gerrymandering, and most importantly, by winning the hearts and minds of American citizens by giving them an accurate history of the past. As a historian, I'm rather fond of the last. After all, the past informs our present and guides our future. Now, if the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction teaches us anything, it is that those who would overthrow American democracy and the Republic must never be compromised with. They must be politically defeated again and again. This does not mean a call for another civil war, which is both irresponsible and panders to the violent right today. But to ensure, in Lincoln's very familiar yet timeless words, that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Okay, I think I stuck to my time limit. So I'm going to cede the floor to our third speaker.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Manisha.
It's me. All right. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad people made it out to here. Lots of things doing a beautiful, balmy 75-degree afternoon here in Austin. I love the bio you read. There was an important omission, though. I was a guest on This Is Democracy. So
2 times.
yes, one of my proudest accomplishments. And in addition to the book, I had a chance to review and listen to the podcast on the book. And I want to recall Jeremi Suri, who's our Austin's poet laureate, which is really cool. His just vivid imagery about other orchards and his concerns about lying ghosts that you were addressing. So that was a really good framing for our conversation. And as you were talking, Jeremy, and I was taking notes furiously, my watch buzzes, and it's an alert from the New York Times, and it alerts me that the Oath Keeper Stuart Rhodes was just found guilty of seditious conspiracy. So the optimism, I think, is perhaps there. So, I'm not a historian. I play one on TV, but I'm an educational researcher. I'm also a former fourth grade teacher and a middle school teacher. And so my lens in this conversation is about how do we bring this to young people, because that to me is the most important piece of this. It is wonderful that we're having a conversation with scholars and people with fancy degrees and a very nice building, but the impact of this book has to be beyond groups like this. And I think about something you said about the textbooks having caught up. So, how do we infuse this knowledge in curriculum where curriculums become a battleground, right? Literally, I was looking on social media recently about some of the astroturfing that took place in school board meetings would go there and, berate and harass, publicly elected people on what they considered to be the truth, right? Which was not from reading Jeremi Suri's book, but from other sources. As somebody who was educated in the state of Texas, not that long ago, but I guess it was a long time ago, in the 1980s, and the conceit of having Texas history as part of their curriculum, right? You have that, right? But never really engaging in discussions of the cornerstone speech, right? There was an active, and there still is an active conversation about the purpose of the Confederacy. Was it in fact to promote states' rights? Well, the cornerstone speech kind of blows out of the war. It's in black and white. He said it, right? I didn't learn that in high school. I was fortunate to come to school at UT and be taught by George Wright. And I learned Eric Foner and other people from him from that course, where I was like, how come nobody told me this, right? And I think the same disbelief that a lot of people go through when they first encounter a challenge to a narrative they've heard their entire lives. How can this be? How can this be? You claim this is true. How can this possibly be? I read the books from birth to high school. And Jeremy, you're a public scholar, and I admire you so much because you have engaged so artfully in conversation, whether it's in, newspapers or in op-eds and other things you've done. And I'm thinking about how is the media going to be leveraged and used to bring these narratives to the forefront. This is a great book. I don't think that we're going to read it cover to cover, unfortunately. So how do we, and how do you, and how can we help you in that process of bringing the great historical knowledge forth so people can access it, right? And I'm thinking about, you thought about a documentary or other series or there's social media ways to get the word out about this book, right? And I know you probably have thought about that quite a bit. And to return to the idea of textbooks, one thing that I've written about is just the history of textbook adoption in this country. And it's a history that most of us don't know, but the United States of the Confederacy and their role of ensuring that white supremacy was infused throughout the curriculum. And that's a history that, I think up until like the 90s, there were books that were very clearly advancing the lost cause. And even today, the books don't really grapple with the complexities and the things you talk about, such as the Confederates moving to Mexico and Brazil. I think about sort of boomers to Gen Xers. That's the history we learned. So how are we able to access and have that narrative displaced? How are we able to have, an archetype or a framework replaced with something that's more accurate and more truthful through your primary source research? Like you actually found the documents, the narratives that disprove the things that we were taught, right? I'm also thinking about the role of misinformation and indoctrination, right? So I think it's a profound irony that those in society who claim to be the defenders of the Constitution and the most patriotic are the ones who are most misinformed and most indoctrinated, right? you know, are we not stronger for knowing the truth of our origins? I mean, I think I read this in conjunction with reading our colleague Pinot Joseph's for Reconstruction. And I just feel this is such it's almost a burden being lifted to know, oh, that's the true story, or that's what really happened, right? And why is that narrative considered to be a challenge? Like, why is that not embraced? Like, this is great. And there's actually really rich information about the power of multiracial democracy and activism and resistance in the book. Like, that's actually empowering people, right? It refutes white supremacy. That's part of the problem, right? That's why it's not popular. And so I go back to the idea of sort of penetrating beyond the ivory walls. I also like sort of your reasoning and thinking about how reconciling and reckoning with the past is something that has been done other places. Germany, you know, I think there are such great examples, and another part of American exceptionalism is that we don't talk about the examples that exist in the world about how we might better engage and thoughtfully think about, well, this is tough for a lot of us to understand and hear, but it actually is in fact empowering. You know, starting the book with 1-6, I think is really powerful, because I think, you know, the making the familiar strange, or the strange familiar, right? Like, okay, well, the paramilitarism of the oath keepers, those kinds of imagery, that's not new, that's old stuff, right? And they actually harken to that history, right? They actually claim that, right? And so, yeah, you're right. And the reasoning behind that is because these are the groups that were really, I guess, most engaged in the fight against true multiracial democracies, right? And so I was thinking to myself, well, what do we do with civil war by other means? Like, you know, there are going to be people who read the book, right? That's going to be great. I'm excited for that. But will there be community discussions about it? Will there be people in neighborhoods saying, you know, you should read this book? I'm thinking about how Abraham Kendi sort of took, you know, his very thick volume and sort of made it into an accessible thing that kids can read. And I'm hoping that might be part of your plan, right?
That's Zachary's job.
Zachary might do that, create some poems for us. You know, and so I think as I sort of close my comments, I'm thinking about how this book is a testament to the centrality of democratic participation and citizenship, right? And how Black Americans have embraced this. So my work on Black families, we talk about middle-class Black families being the group that is most animated and most engaged and most believing in the Constitution, right? This is the group that made that happen and believes it, right? And I'm thinking about the activists in the past, to Stacey Abrams today, you know, and then what can young people learn from this? We just went through an election cycle.
Yeah.
There's one coming up in 2 years. It'll be exciting to think about. And like, how can this book be part of that animation of young people? I spent some time working with Move Texas last cycle, and, you know, getting young folks to be really engaged, especially when democratic processes we've been discussing have not always resulted in what we consider to be democratic outcomes, right? What we did the things we're supposed to do, and what we wanted to have happen that has proven to be popular through polling and other things isn't happening. And so I think this book is a tool to help us understand that better. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about thinking about how we talk to young people who are in 4th grade, in middle school, just becoming a voting age, to think about the importance of democratic engagement at a point where one might feel like, if you listen to narratives in the media, well, that was a huge disappointment, right? When in fact, historically, this last midterm was pretty profoundly impactful when it came to what happened as far as the expectations and the outcomes, right? Very different. And in a lot of ways, there's a really exciting, I think, piece to be written about that.
Yep.
But I'm so proud of you, and I'm proud of how you've engaged with the public in your work. And I just want to know about how you'll continue to do that.
Great. Thank you, Rich.
All right, so
should-
you have,
Okay, I have a lot. There was a lot, so I won't have a chance to
you gotta
respond.
be brief, so.
Yeah,
so
I know, and we want to hear from others, so I'll just pick a couple of issues up, but let me thank Jackie and Manisha and Rich. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of book events already, but these have been some of the best comments by far. And really, best comments because they're helpful for me, and because they're kind, but also critical, which is actually the best the best kind of commentary. So let me connect Rich's last point with Jackie's point about class and her defense of Kevin Seafried and Southern Delaware. I had forgotten about that connection that you have, Jackie. For those who haven't read the book, I open with a bit of a character portrayal of Kevin Seafried, who is the person you would recognize. And we did not include his photo in the book. There was a big debate about that, whether to give him a platform or not. He's the fellow who carries in this super large Confederate flag. He actually used it to break a window, to hit a police officer, and then carried it. And as Jackie said, he drove from Southern Delaware with his son and his son's girlfriend. And in his affidavit, by the way, he's still proud his son was there. One of the things he's proud of is that his son saw him do this, right? That he made a difference. I completely agree with Jackie that understanding neo-Confederate ideology and understanding Trumpism, one has to pay attention to the wealthy who are bankrolling this. There's no doubt about that. And those who either hold their nose because they think this benefits their taxes, or those who support this. And that's a necessary but not sufficient way of understanding neo-Confederacy and Trumpism. But I do think what to me remains most striking are those who are screwed over by those ideologies who yet nonetheless embrace them continually, right? And to me that's actually one of the motivators here. So it's not that I'm averse to analyzing. I think that's a class argument in many respects, but I think one of the puzzles for me is why this has such strong continuity for so long. Why is it that the Kevin Seafrieds of the world are continually drawn to these kinds of politics, and why at this moment, and the optimistic note for me, Jackie, is that maybe Trump is the unmasking of how horrible this is, because he's so almost caricature in his extreme, right? That unlike a George W. Bush, who might play to those politics, let's remember, right? It's Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. who did the Willie Horton ads and all of that sort of stuff, right? Those who might play to it with a bow tie and a fine country club sound, right? Don't unmask this in the way someone like Trump, who's the worst of the New York City that I grew up in, that everyone gets to see every day, right? So you know, to me, the Kevin Seafrieds are the story, right? They're the ones who make the difference, and the contrast with African American, with you know, I think of the voters who I think are going to elect, I hope Senator Warnock re-elect him in Georgia. Those who elected him the first time are going to be middle-class Black voters in Fulton County, right? They're going to be Black women in Fulton County and others who will be acting in very different ways, even though they have as much, if not more, reason to be angry at their condition than the Kevin Seafrieds of the world. Kevin Seafried is a victim of the Rust Belt in American society, right? A manufacturing community that doesn't have manufacturing anymore. So for me, what drives me in this book is trying to understand what are the politics that are used to manipulate and appeal to those individuals. And so I think absolutely there's so much more to be said. I talk a little bit about, especially about African-American Union soldiers, but there's much more to be said, absolutely. And many have written, and your book will be an amazing contribution to this, Jackie. You know, there's a lot to be done in this area, but I don't think that story and the story of our politics that one substitutes for the other. And my view is that as a political historian, this is a bias I have, that actually in recent years, we haven't paid as much attention as historians to the politics, because we had overemphasized. We had paid too much attention to that in the Dunning School years and in other periods. And so we had moved on to study other elements of this. Appropriately enough, that work is needed. This work is not better than that, but I do think that the politics sometimes get lost, and I'm a believer, and the Trump years have reinforced for me how much the political leadership in a society where political leaders are still, in many cases, white men, why that matters, and understanding how they act and why they act as they do. That's my project in this case to some extent. That does not have to be, that's not any total history of this period. And so I take your comments on what should be suggestions as things that merit more study and more writing. But I hope that we can have a narrative that brings in all of these elements of the story, which I think is what you're arguing for as well. I think we're disagreeing in any way. And again, I just want to emphasize, for me, to see this unmasked is an optimistic opening, because it allows us to see and diagnose the problem. And so to Rich's question, obviously I believe in doing public history. I probably spend too much time doing that. I certainly spent too much time traveling the last few weeks. But what I find as an avenue and an opportunity for us, and it's why we do the podcast, for example, is to get people interested in history, doing exactly the opposite of what my good friend James Sweet argued, right? Which is instead of trying to divorce the past from the present, actually leaning into the present. And I think for young people today, and I see this as an instructor of young people here, right? There is more and more of an interest than ever before in understanding what brought us to this moment today. Moments of crisis, moments of disruption are opportunities for us. And so we can talk about different media, how one does it, but it does strike me that leaning into the crisis of the moment as a historian and resisting the urge to wag our finger and tell people what to do, but instead saying, here we can help explain how we came to this moment, how we can, what I've been saying at book talks is, we are at our best. We're not, in my son and daughter's view, we're not the right kind of doctors. We can't actually make you feel better. But we do that kind of work. We diagnose, right? We tell you where the problem came from. And I think that's something we should lean into more. And for my fellow diplomatic historians and military historians who want to go around and pretend they're policymakers, we should stop doing that. We're not policymakers, right? We are people diagnosing where our issues come from. I wanted to say a few words about Manisha's superb comments. So these were all great comments, super helpful. I look forward to thinking more about them. I think the connection to imperialism is absolutely right. And truth be told, Manisha, there was a version of the Exiles chapter that had a whole riff on imperialism. And maybe I didn't find the way to write it in narrative form, because I was going here to try to write a narrative that non-historians would read. But I ended on the advice of my editor, which I accepted, cutting a lot of that out, because it became more of an exegesis on imperialism. And that doesn't mean it shouldn't be there. But writing a narrative that was centered on the US with these moments that show the international dimensions, but still keeping it US focused, was a narrative strategy. I don't think that's necessarily the right analytical strategy, but that was the narrative strategy. That just comes to an old methodological point about how hard it is to do both of these things at the same time. Maybe your book will be the model for us on that. On the Black codes, I agree with you that they did not help poor whites. But what's interesting to me, what I learned trying to see things through Andrew Johnson's eyes, which is a dark experience, is that they were perceived in that way. Whether they did that or not, they were perceived, they were sold. There was the perception among Johnson and many supporters of Johnson that these Black codes were going to limit the competition for poor white tailors like Johnson and others. I recognize that's not the reality, but I think that perception mattered in making these incredibly popular. I mean, it's hard. You would know this better than I would. It's hard to find a great deal of resistance to these codes from white Democrats in the South, even poor white Democrats who you would argue from any economic analysis, as you say, should not be supportive of this. And so the perception is really what I was getting at there. And then last point, I just wanted to affirm what you said, that I think one of the legacies, one of the lessons I was trying to, in a non-didactic way, come to in the book was that you said compromise. I'm going to use the word apologize or just move on. You cannot just move on from the past, because then the bad guys come back, which is exactly what happens here. I don't actually say this in the chapter. I took it out because I wanted to focus on the other legacies. One of the other things I came to believe is that we need to eliminate executive pardons. They're just not used. They're a monarchical privilege that's inherited in the presidency And it's very hard to come up with examples. Governors often use them to pardon people on death row. It's a different story. But presidents, in part because the federal justice system doesn't work that way, more often than not, pardons are being used actually to help, in Bill Clinton's case, campaign donors. And we know what happens in Trump's case. We know what will happen if there's another Trump presidency, right? And so I think this is another way of getting at your point, right? We can't pardon the past. And I think we have to be better as historians, and especially in our public work, at explaining why. It's not about revenge. It's not about trying to show that we're woke. It's about actually the justice, the application of justice and holding people accountable is crucial for democracy to move forward. And I don't think we've made that case strong enough. And I think we have the historical evidence, especially in this particular moment, to show exactly that.
Well, wonderful. We have about 15 minutes for a wider conversation. So any questions from the audience?
I think we have people on.
Oh, from the audience online too. Yes, there's a question. Go ahead.
I think I'm just curious, seems like a little tepid as a solution to say that you're diagnosing and not making policy or helping to make policy.
Well, I think that diagnosing is helping policy, but I think we have to resist the urge to think that we know what the solutions are. Because I think the more you get into the history, the difficulty of the solutions becomes so clear, right? I mean, I don't think there are a lot of bad actors in this book.
Yeah.
But they're clever. Andrew Johnson is very clever. He turns all of Lincoln's language about presidential power to his own purpose, right? He says, yeah, Lincoln says the states never actually seceded, so that means I don't need Congress to approve them coming back in. It's actually a very clever argument he makes, right? I think he's wrong, but so my point being that actually, I think what looks like a policy solution to a group of people around a seminar table is often not in reality.
But couldn't you have a relationship with people who are making policy?
I believe in that, and a little bit have done that, but I think I still think we have to be careful not to be. If we're the role of the historian, I think should be to help the policymaker better understand the problem and better recognize which solutions don't make sense for that problem and which ones might make more sense, but not to be the solution authors. I think that's another enterprise that we can do too, but that's not the enterprise of the historian. And I think we too quickly jump into that or allow ourselves to be caricatured as that. Aaron, you wanted to come on?
Yeah, wonderful talk. I very much enjoyed how the discussant said that your past, the stories about Reconstruction don't quite cram very well into the January 6th story. I'd like to do it the other way around by saying there were parts about the January 6th story that I now want to know, was any of that happening in the 1870s and such? So sure, organized militias and veterans are disproportionately represented in January 6th, so we can talk about some degree of organized violent groups. But other big thirds are of those groups is there's a large group of evangelicals who were coming at it from a religious perspective about restoration and following the religious guidance. And there was a group of some of the QAnon sort of crazies that are different but all interrelated, right? So in the period you studied, you've charted how the veterans like literally came back and reinstituted power. We know the Klan institutes organized military power. Are any religious forces involved in this, or organized religious groups involved in this story? Or is this still a time when participation in politics was seen as anathema for evangelicals and the other types of rural people that I imagine fit alongside the story you're telling?
It's a great question. I don't want to be the only one to answer because there are at least 3 other people here who know this at least as well as I do, if not better. I would say in my research, there's no equivalent of contemporary evangelicals. Christianity in the United States is not expressed in quite that way. The evangelical movement as we know it today is really a late 20th century movement. It would be unrecognizable. But religious institutions are deeply embedded in the work of white supremacy. not as evangelical institutions, but as homes, as protectors, as apologists for, as rationalizers for, and repeatedly, in the newspapers, as I'm reading them, you have religious figures commenting all the time, cheerleaders, participants, but it's still different. I don't want to say it's the same as the evangelical movement, because there isn't a movement as such. But I want to, Jackie and Manisha.
Yeah, so I would reinforce what you just said, Jeremy. There is a religious aspect to it, and a strong one. I mean, remember, they talk about the South being redeemed, and that comes straight from pro-slavery Christianity. So many Southern clergymen are involved in the secession movement and have this kind of fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. The evangelicals today are literally direct descendants of them, right? The Southern Baptist Convention that seceded from the National Baptists, the Methodists that seceded from the National Methodists, and that apologized for defending slavery in the 1990s. So there is this strain of fundamentalist, reactionary religious thinking. They call themselves evangelicals. There were Northern evangelicals who were anti-slavery, and today they are mainly liberal Protestant churches in the North who are literally the lineal descendants of that side of evangelicalism. But I think religion is important. Donald Matthews, who writes a lot about Southern religion, also looks at the ways in which racial violence, especially lynching, is justified through religious idiom in the South. That clergymen and churches are very much complicit in this. There are others, Baptized in Blood, Charles Reagan's book on Southern nationalism, that looks at that. So I do think there is a kind of a reactionary variant in religious thinking, and I do not use the term redemption or redeemed at all, because I think it's a very loaded term, just as the way I don't use terms like scalawags and carpetbaggers. Those are the terms that were put into place by Southern apologists for the overthrow of Reconstruction. So I use the term restoration. It was a project that Andrew Johnson wanted, whose poor white credentials, I think, are exaggerated. Remember, he was a slaveholder. And if you owned even one, he began very poor, but he owned 5 slaves on the eve of the Civil War. And if you owned 1 slave in the South, you were richer than an average Northern farmer. So, yeah, I think these questions are important. There are no direct parallels. I think the problem is when people try to draw direct parallels. I think what's interesting about Jeremi's book is the notion of the afterlives and the legacies of these really unresolved problems, and something as basic as Black citizenship that continues to be contested, in terms of voter suppression and other things. Battles that we thought were long won continually need to be refought, which is what I think makes democracy a contested project in the United States, and not that mythic linear view that we've always had.
I would just add that it seems to me that a lot of big evangelical megachurches today are racially integrated. So I'm not sure that, we can, certainly the evangelical support for Trumpism is strong and obvious, but I think it's complicated. So I'm not sure, if we can say that evangelicals today are on board with the Neo-Confederate project when they are, I think, are very open to members of a variety of backgrounds and nationalities even. So I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting comment, because one of the things about Trumpism today is that they now have more African Americans in the House of Representatives than they ever had. So the parallel of white supremacy in Reconstruction with politics today of Trumpism, I wonder whether it holds completely.
Yeah. So, that's a really good question, and it's a really difficult issue to talk about, right? But I think we have to, right? you can find people from a particular group who will support your position, even if it undermines the group you think they come from. That doesn't mean that they are no longer part of, that they don't embrace that ideology. So this is the story people will often say, right? How is it possible that Donald Trump could have a daughter who converts to Judaism and be anti-Semitic? That's not a problem at all, right? You can always make exceptions for certain people. And you can often find people from a group who will embrace the ideology that undermines their group, right? Marx himself writes about this, right? The petit bourgeois, right? And so I don't think that's very revealing, that you can find a bunch of Allen Keys and the equivalents of that to stand in. I think what is right, though, what is true, and what Jackie's getting at is that there's a complex mix of things. So there are neo-Confederate elements, but there are also other elements in there that attract other people for other reasons, right? So there was a really interesting piece in the Times today about a number of Jews who are now saying, finally, Jewish leaders, Trump has gone too far now by having dinner with an arch anti-Semite,
that to happen.
right? And what's really interesting is they say, well, we saw all these problems early on, but we held our nose because there were other things. Because he was really strong on Israel. And so because he was strong on Israel, there was someone, I forget, I think it's from the World Zionist Congress, who says in today's Times, because he was strong on Israel, we accepted some of his other anti-Semitism, right? And so you can have a mix. I think it's what Jackie's getting at, right? You can have people who are pulled into a movement for different reasons. That doesn't negate the central element of neo-Confederate ideology. It just means there are other things there that pull other people in for other reasons. And they focus on those other things. People are complex political actors, right? Does that get at what you were getting at, Jackie?
Yeah. I think it's, difficult to pull apart these strands of cultural resentment, deep religious belief, performative elements. How many people really believe these awful things they're saying, or are they looking for attention? Are they looking for headlines? Are they looking to stay in the news? So I think it gets kind of complicated.
But to me, what's essential about this, right? What's necessary in understanding Trumpism is this part of it. It's not the only part. It might not even be half of it, but it's an essential. I can't imagine him without this, right? And that is why the people like Kevin Seifried and the Ben Tillmans and others fascinate me, right? Because there's something about it. There's this racialized neo-Confederate ideology that draws people in who you could say for all kinds of other objective reasons should not identify with this wealthy New York, not even really wealthy, this shyster New York businessman, right? Who's fucking them over all the time, right? But nonetheless, they identify with him because of that element. And I think that's there in the 1870s, that's there today. And for me, as a historian, I think political historians have to pay more attention to that. We haven't paid enough attention until now.
Talking about the New York Times, there is this op-ed contributor, Jamil Bowie, who's been writing for a while, for a couple of years, on these parallels between Reconstruction and politics today. I don't know, and many of the things that you described today, he's been arguing for.
No, he's very good.
Yeah,
he's a history graduate from UVA, I think, actually. Right? He's a history graduate from UVA. I think he reads very actively in this area.
Right, but he's made a career as an op-ed in the last, at least in the last few months, of drawing these parallels between Reconstruction and the politics of today.
Well, I think those of us in this discussion now are only a small subset of those who are interested in history who have been pulled back to the 19th century by the Trump era. And I think that's really interesting. I think at some point there's a historiographical essay to be written about that, right? Biden came into office and the presumption was we were going to have a discussion about the New Deal. But we haven't been having a discussion about the New Deal. We've been having a discussion about Reconstruction. And I think that's really interesting. I think that indicates something. And again, and I know Jackie's thinking, Jeremi always likes to be optimistic, but it makes me optimistic because there's, as you said, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we can learn. And I think I look at my son's generation of young people, and I think they are going to be, at least those who are educated in environments where they really get educated, which is not everyone, but a significant number of young people, they are going to have a better appreciation of this than I think we did.
You know, I want to return to the comment about the role of evangelicals. And I was reading a piece, I can't remember who wrote it in the Atlantic, about sort of participation of more and more pastors who, you know, not typically, but, you know, maybe hinted at a certain political leaning, becoming virulently and aggressively pro-Trump, right? And then this whole emergence of dominionism, right? And like, you know, Trump as King David, like, well, we need him because ultimately it gets to our goals, right? So all these things that are horrible and personally disqualifying. I like what you said about the fact that, you know, all Trump is you know, basically Republican sort of policies, more grotesque, but it's not like he's a radical departure from a lot of things that were coming out already. But I think about the that's perhaps a new thing, like the idea that the end times are near, and so whatever it takes to seize control of the political apparatus, that's fine. It's justified. We won't have a problem with somebody who is morally and, you know, ecclesiastically just terribly far off. That's no longer a thing, as long as we get to the ultimate goal in mind, which is an interesting take. I need to look up the article, but it scared me, actually, the article in the Atlantic about how, you know, you might make the presumption, you might hear a pastor sort of allude or make comments about certain things. Now people coming out and saying, this is the guy, and as part of my flock, you must support this guy. That seems like a new term. I don't know.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think there's, again, I think Manisha is certainly read more deeply in this. I'm sure Jackie has too than I have, but it does strike me there is some of that with the Confederacy too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not an evangelical movement in the sense that they're not mega churches, but I do think, I mean, religious leaders, it's true in my own faith, it's true in the Jewish faith, right? I mean, there are plenty of Orthodox Jews who are saying Netanyahu is, in essence, the Messiah, right? And he should be brought back into power again. I mean, unfortunately, religious figures will often find themselves corrupted by power, if that's fair, in the same way that everyone else gets corrupted by power. Power corrupts.
The piece I was talking about is a June 22 by Tim Alberta, How Politics Poison the Evangelical Church. Really interesting read. Scary read. Interesting.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's 5:30 and right on time. Thank you to the panelists online, for everyone here. We are all invited for our panel on Monday. The Institute's panel organized by John Carranza do you mind telling us the title? Reminding us about the title?
Social and political histories of family formation of the state.
Fantastic.
Right, thank you.
Fantastic. Jackie, Manisha, and everyone online, thank you. I know there are a lot of people online. I hope we didn't miss any questions.
Great to see everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.